March 1945. The island was still breathing smoke. From the black sand of Iwo Jima rose pillars of ash that twisted like ghosts into a gray sky. All around, the ground trembled with the faint, delayed thuds of explosions far away, reminders that the war, though declared finished here, had not yet left the hearts of those who survived it. Among the broken ridges, a group of Japanese prisoners sat barefoot in the dirt. Their boots, torn, soaked with seawater, stiff with blood and sand, had been taken from them at dawn. No one had explained why. They waited in silence, eyes lowered, backs bent under the weight of fear that had been carved into their bones since childhood. Each man carried the same thought, but dared not speak it aloud. The Americans are going to kill us. For years, they had been told that capture meant shame worse than death. That Americans were demons who would torture them, strip them, humiliate them. Every training speech, every poster, every whispered rumor on the wind had repeated it. Surrender was a betrayal of the emperor. To live as a prisoner was to become something less than human. Now, with their boots gone, that prophecy seemed to be coming true. One of them, a boy really no older than 19, stared at the horizon where the sea shimmered like molten metal under the morning light. His name was Ishikawa. Back home, he had worked in his father's fishing boat before being drafted. The smell of salt still clung to him, even after months in the island's sulfur air. He tried to remember the sound of gulls over Yokohama harbor, the hum of the boat's engine, the small laughter of his younger sister when she brought rice balls for the crew. But memory was fragile now. It kept slipping through the cracks of exhaustion. A shadow fell over him. He looked up. 2 American soldiers were approaching, boots crunching on volcanic sand. Their rifles hung low, muzzles pointed to the ground. One of them carried something, a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. The prisoners stiffened. The soldiers said nothing at first. One pointed at the row of men and gestured with his hand. "Stand up." Ishikawa's heart began to hammer. He rose slowly, trembling, his bare feet sinking into the hot, grainy earth. The air smelled of metal and seaweed and burnt oil. He could taste salt and smoke. The soldier opened the sack. Inside were boots, clean, dry, laces neatly coiled. American issue. The soldier began handing them out, one pair at a time. For a long moment, no one moved. The prisoners stared as if watching some impossible dream unfold. Then cautiously, one man took a pair. Another followed. When Ishikawa's turn came, he bowed without knowing why. His hands shook as he accepted the boots. They were heavy and soft at the same time, worn but cared for. The soldier nodded once, a simple motion, neither friendly nor cruel, just human. Ishikawa slipped his feet inside. The leather was warm from the sun. Didn't fit perfectly, but it was dry, clean, a gift of order in a world gone mad. He wanted to cry. Behind him, someone whispered, "They're giving us boots." The words carried down the line, spreading disbelief like wind through dry grass. One prisoner began sobbing quietly. Another covered his face. None of them knew how to respond. Their minds had no language for mercy. The Americans turned and walked back toward their camp, leaving behind footprints that cut a path between the wreckage and the sea. Ishikawa watched them go. The image of those boots, leaving prints, not blood, would stay with him for years. He looked down at his own feet. The black sand no longer burned. It was just sand. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships were anchored, huge gray beasts floating in silence. The sound of engines and clanging metal drifted faintly across the waves. A white flag fluttered weakly over a broken bunker nearby, its fabric stained but still visible. The war was ending. But no one here knew how to stop fighting inside. That night, As the wind swept over Iwo Jima, Ishikawa lay awake on the ground beneath a makeshift tarp. He turned the boots over in his hands, again and again, as if trying to decipher a message hidden in their seams. Why would the enemy give shoes to those they had defeated? He remembered the words of his training officer, a man who once told recruits that Americans were animals who wore smiles to hide their cruelty. Yet today, those same animals had given him boots to protect his feet from the burning earth. Ishikawa felt confusion tighten his chest. Something inside him, a wall built of fear and obedience, began to crack. He thought of his father again, of the fishing nets glistening in morning light. He wondered if the ocean smelled the same now, or if even the sea had grown tired of swallowing dead men. In the distance, faint music drifted from the American camp. A harmonica, soft and uncertain, playing a tune that rose and fell like the tide. The sound was strange, haunting, almost tender. For the first time in months, Ishikawa did not think about death. He thought about walking, about standing upright again, about living somehow, even as a prisoner. He touched the boots once more, then placed them beside his head as he drifted toward sleep. The stars above Iwo Jima shimmered faintly through the smoke, like souls still waiting for peace. At dawn, the boots creaked when they walked. It was the sound of something unfamiliar, not the worn rhythm of army march, not the clatter of desperate retreat. It was softer, hesitant, like men learning to walk again after crawling through fire. The Japanese prisoners moved in a slow line along the black sand, carrying stretchers and crates for the Americans. Their new boots left fresh impressions in the volcanic soil, marks that looked almost ceremonial, symbols of a passage neither side could yet understand. The air smelled of diesel and the faint sweetness of canned peaches, the breakfast scent of the occupying camp. Ishikawa walked near the end of the line, his eyes fixed on the earth, afraid that even gratitude might be seen as weakness. He could feel the leather molding around his feet, stiff but warm. Every step whispered something impossible. You are still alive. The Americans guarding them spoke in low tones. Words carried on the wind, phrases Ishikawa couldn't decipher. But their voices were calm, not the growl of conquerors, just the tired murmur of men who had also seen too much. As they passed a shattered Japanese bunker, Ishikawa caught a glimpse of something familiar. A tattered flag still clinging to a pole half buried in ash. The red sun had faded to pale rust. He slowed, staring, until one of the guards motioned for him to keep moving. The flag barely moved in the wind. It looked less like a symbol now, and more like a memory that refused to die. Later that morning, the prisoners were ordered to dig trenches for water lines. The work was grueling, the ground still hot, the air thick with sulfur fumes. But even then, there was something different about this labor. No one shouted. No rifle butts struck their backs. The Americans watched, but not with hatred. One of the guards, a tall corporal with sunburned skin and a quiet voice, walked over with a canteen. He held it out toward Ishikawa. The Japanese soldier hesitated. His instinct screamed trap. He'd been told that water could be poisoned, that surrender was an invitation to mockery. Yet the man's face was blank, neither cruel nor kind, simply human. The corporal tilted the canteen slightly, as if to say, "Go on." Ishikawa took it. The metal was cool against his palms. He drank slowly. The water tasted of tin and life. When he handed it back, the American nodded once, wiped his brow, and walked away. No words, no ceremony. Just an exchange between two men breathing the same air. The moment passed, but something in Ishikawa's chest shifted again. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was recognition. As the day wore on, the prisoners began to whisper to each other. Their voices were low, uncertain, like men afraid of their own thoughts. They treat us like men. one murmured. For now, another said, eyes narrow with suspicion. Maybe the war truly is over, someone else added. But for many, that was the hardest truth to accept. That the empire they had given everything to had vanished overnight. The code that had ruled their lives, the songs they had shouted before battle, the faces of comrades who had died shouting Tenno Heika Banzai, all of it had dissolved into silence and smoke. What remained was hunger, exhaustion, and boots that no longer burned their feet. At sunset, the guards ordered them to halt work and line up. The sky was bruised with red and violet, the sea glinting gold as the sun sank into the horizon. From the American camp, the smell of cooked food drifted. Meat, onions, and something sweet. Then came an order none of them expected. Sit, rest? The prisoners obeyed cautiously. Some kept their hands on their knees, waiting for another command. Instead, American soldiers came by carrying boxes, ration tins, biscuits, coffee. Ishikawa stared at the steaming mug placed before him. The scent was rich, bitter, and strange. He had never tasted coffee before. His throat tightened. He didn't know whether to drink or refuse. The corporal from earlier knelt beside him, gestured with his hand. Drink. It's all right. Ishikawa looked at him, then down at the dark liquid. He took a sip. The taste was sharp, almost painful, then warm. It spread through him like the slow return of blood to a frozen limb. For a fleeting second, he felt tears rise behind his eyes. Not from sadness, but from the unbearable gentleness of it all. The others drank too, clumsy at first, coughing at the bitterness. A few laughed, quietly, nervously, as if afraid the sound might wake something angry in the air. And the Americans watched them, not as enemies, but as men who had survived the same madness. Night fell. The waves crashed against the beach, erasing old footprints and replacing them with new ones. In the dim light of oil lamps, Ishikawa looked down at his boots again. They were dusted with ash and salt, no longer new, but already part of him. He thought of his mother's voice, soft and distant, whispering words from a time before uniforms, before war, before fear. Somewhere deep inside, he understood. These acts were not meant to erase what had happened. They could never undo the screams, the fire, the ruins. But they carried a different message. That even here, among the wreckage of hatred, something human could still flicker. And for the first time since the Emperor's voice had echoed over the radio announcing surrender, Ishikawa allowed himself to believe that life, fragile, uncertain, but real, might continue. He leaned back, watching the glow of American campfires along the shore. Each light danced like a tiny sun reborn from darkness. In the rhythm of waves and crackling flames, he thought he could almost hear words forming from the wind. Not in Japanese, not in English, but in the ancient tongue of survival. We are still here. Morning came again, slow and pale. The salt wind off the Pacific rolled across Iwo Jima like a memory that would not leave. The black sand still bore scars, scorched tank treads, shattered steel, forgotten helmets half buried where men had fallen. But within the prisoner enclosure, something unspoken had begun to shift. The Americans brought water trucks. That alone caused unease. The guards pointed toward a wooden structure hastily assembled from salvaged debris. It looked like a bathhouse, crude walls, a corrugated metal roof, steam curling through gaps in the siding. The order came. No shouting, no rifles raised, just a gesture. One by one, the Japanese prisoners were told to go inside. Ishikawa hesitated. He'd heard rumors about the enemy, about poison showers, about humiliation masked as kindness. His training had warned him. The enemy gives you comfort only when they want to destroy you with softness. Still, the guard said nothing, just waited. Inside, it was warm. Steam clung to the ceiling. Buckets of hot water stood beside shallow basins. Bars of soap, American, square, pale yellow, had been laid out along a wooden bench. Clean towels, too. No barbed wire, no waiting executioners, just heat, water, and silence. Ishikawa looked around. Some of his comrades stood frozen, hands shaking as they reached for the soap. Others rubbed at their arms as if trying to remove the months of fear baked into their skin. The corporal from the day before they entered, carrying a small pouch. He knelt beside a prisoner whose back was riddled with shrapnel scars and began gently applying ointment. Not a word passed between them. Ishikawa stared. The corporal wasn't mocking, wasn't filming, wasn't boasting to others. He worked quietly, respectfully, like a man tending a wounded animal. Not because he pitied the prisoner, but because it was the right thing to do. Ishikawa moved to a basin, knelt, and dipped his hands into the water. It was hot, not scalding, but hot. The kind of heat that soothed cracked skin. He poured it over his head, over his shoulders, gasping softly as steam wrapped around him. Then the soap. He had not used soap in months. He barely remembered its texture. Now, as he worked it across his arms, it lathered thick and white, washing away ash, grime, and dried blood. As it slid from his skin, he realized what he was truly washing away. Not just the dirt of war, but the mask of hatred, the armor of lies, the belief that the enemy could never show mercy. His fingers trembled, his breath caught, and then something else. A soft hand placed a folded towel beside him. Ishikawa turned. It was not a soldier, but a woman. An American Red Cross nurse. She did not smile, did not speak. Just placed the towel and stepped back, her eyes tired, but not unkind. She did not see a monster. She saw a man. That single moment unraveled something inside him. He gripped the towel as if it were a sacred object, a symbol of something he had forgotten, that even among strangers, dignity could survive. Outside the bathhouse, the prisoners emerged one by one, faces raw and flushed from heat. Their hair was damp. Their uniforms, the same tattered ones, clung to cleaner skin. They looked at each other differently now. Not with suspicion, not with hollow obedience, but with the quiet recognition of men who had stepped into fire and somehow come out breathing. That afternoon, a storm rolled in from the north. The sky darkened, wind lashing the tents and rattling the metal of mess pots. Rain began to fall, not in torrents, but in long, steady sheets. The prisoners stood in the downpour, boots rooted in the softening mud. None asked to move. They lifted their faces to the sky and let the rain do what the water buckets had started. Some wept, some raised hands as if in prayer, and the Americans let them be. There were no orders to get inside, no threats. Just the sound of falling rain and the scent of soap still clinging to damp skin. Ishikawa stood beside a former sergeant, a man who once barked orders with the emperor's name on his lips. Now he was quiet, eyes closed, lips parted as if repeating a prayer no longer in the imperial tongue, but in the language of those who had almost drowned and been pulled back to shore. Later that evening, the corporal returned, carrying a small metal tin. He opened it and showed them its contents. Razors, shaving kits. He gestured again, clean up. Not because they were going to be paraded, not because they were being humiliated, but because, in this strange new chapter, the Americans seemed to be telling them something that needed no words. You're still men, and men deserve to be clean, warm, and alive. Ishikawa knelt in front of a piece of polished tin serving as a mirror. His face stared back, thinner, older, but not broken. With hands still stiff from digging trenches, he shaved. Each stroke peeled away something deeper than stubble. It cut into layers of fear, years of indoctrination, and the belief that worth only came through death in battle. When he finished, he sat back. The man in the reflection was not the soldier who had landed on Iwo Jima months ago. That man had believed Americans were beasts. That mercy was a lie. That capture was worse than execution. But this man, clean and silent beneath the stars, had learned something else. That sometimes the strongest kind of power is the power to spare. And sometimes the deepest wounds are healed by warm water and silence. The next morning, before the sky had fully shaken off the storm's shadow, the prisoners were led toward a different area of the American encampment. A place they had only glimpsed from afar, past crates of rations and rows of tents. The mess zone. The order was strange from the beginning. They were told not to carry shovels or stretchers, not to dig or clean or haul. The only instruction, line up. No one moved at first. Ishikawa and the others looked to one another, unsure. Was this some new humiliation? Another ritual of dominance? Then, a strange sound emerged. Metallic clatter on trays, the pop of tin cans opening, the low bubbling of pots over flame. A smell followed. Warmth, meat, onions. Something buttery. A hot meal. The prisoners, eyes cautious, began walking forward in uneven steps. Ishikawa found himself clutching the edge of his borrowed jacket tighter, as if it might shield him from whatever truth was about to be revealed. When they reached the head of the line, they were handed trays. Real trays. Not slop buckets or scraps tossed on the ground. Each man received a tin tray with dividers, like something from a school or hospital, not a prison. Onto it went a scoop of mashed potatoes, steaming and flecked with black pepper. Then came a thick slice of roast beef, its juices soaking into the potatoes. Green beans, slightly overcooked, but real. And finally, a square of bread. Warm and soft, not stale. At the end of the line, an American soldier stood with a crate of metal utensils. He handed Ishikawa a spoon and a fork. Not tossed. Handed. The prisoner bowed instinctively. Not from submission, but disbelief. The soldier nodded just once and gestured toward a long wooden bench under a canvas canopy. They were to eat seated. This, more than the boots or the bath or the towel, felt surreal. Ishikawa took his place beside the others. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still muted, as if the island itself was watching in solemn curiosity. For a few seconds, no one touched their food. They stared at it. Steam curled upward like incense from an altar. The smell reminded Ishikawa of a time before the war, when his mother had made stew on cold nights, and his brother came home from school with stories of baseball and laughter. Then, slowly, he picked up his spoon. The mashed potatoes were the first to touch his tongue. They were bland, heavy, but hot, and not just in temperature. They carried something into his stomach that had been missing for months. Safety. All around him, others began to eat. There were no jokes, no conversation, just chewing, eyes wide with something between hunger and awe. Halfway through the meal, one of the prisoners, a former naval mechanic, broke down. Quietly, without drama, his spoon clattered to the tray. He covered his face with one trembling hand. The other still held the bread. No one laughed. No one mocked. One of the guards, standing nearby, walked over and crouched beside him. He didn't speak, just placed a canteen next to the tray and rested a hand on the man's shoulder for a moment before stepping back. That gesture, brief, unspoken, shattered something deeper than words. It was not sympathy. It was not guilt. It was something older, acknowledgement. By the time Ishikawa reached the final bites of his bread, he realized his hands had stopped shaking. The fork no longer trembled between his fingers. His breathing had steadied. He was full, not just with food, but with a strange, unbearable sense of being seen. When the prisoners rose to return to their section of the camp, many bowed. Not deeply, not out of tradition, just slightly, awkwardly. A gesture of respect too long forgotten. And the Americans didn't stop them. Later that evening, as the sun dipped into the ocean, its reflection casting long golden stripes across the water, the prisoners sat quietly in their own corner. No one asked for stories. No one spoke of the past, but Ishikawa noticed something. A circle had formed. Not intentional, not arranged, but natural. The shape men make when they want to feel less alone. One of the older soldiers, a former teacher before the war, pulled from his pocket a photograph. It showed two children, a boy and a girl, smiling from a front porch with a dog between them. He passed it around. Each man stared in silence. When it reached Ishikawa, he held it longer than he meant to. The children looked American, round-faced, clean, innocent, and yet something in their eyes reminded him of his sister and cousin, long ago, in a photo buried in ash back home. He handed it back carefully, as if returning a sacred object. In that moment, he did not see enemies. He saw fathers, sons, brothers, and in himself he felt something stir. Something fragile but undeniable. The beginnings of empathy, not forgiveness. That would take years. Not forgetting. That would never come. But the ability to feel again. That night, long after the fires dimmed and the guards made their rounds, Ishikawa lay awake, listening to the distant sound of waves. Somewhere across the island, American voices sang softly. A hymn, perhaps. The words were foreign, but the melody curled through the air like smoke from an offering. He did not understand the language, but he understood the tone. Grief, mercy, hope. For the first time, the silence inside his chest no longer felt like a grave. It felt like the soil before planting. It felt like the soil before planting. The next morning, the sky was bruised with drifting clouds. Neither storm nor calm. The kind of sky that had hung above Iwo Jima long before uniforms came ashore. When the island was still quiet, untouched by war. The lava rock still cooling from ancient fire. The prisoners rose early, as they always did. But this time, the mood was not of dread. It was not comfort either. It was reflection. As if something unnamed had begun to stir within their bones. Still, for some among them, kindness brought not healing, but confusion, even resentment. Don't forget who they are, muttered Tanaka, a gaunt man whose shoulder bore the faded insignia of the Imperial Navy. They killed our brothers. They bombed our cities. This isn't peace. It's insult. No one argued. No one nodded. The words simply hung there, heavy as smoke. Ishikawa listened in silence. He understood Tanaka. Part of him still burned with the same rage. He had seen comrades shredded by artillery, had watched a friend die slowly from a gut wound no morphine could ease. He remembered the roar of flamethrowers, the stink of roasted flesh, but he also remembered the boots, the towel, the coffee. That made things harder, because hatred was easy when you were starved and hunted, but it was much harder when the enemy handed you warmth with no expectation of surrender. Later that morning, the prisoners were led out to help unload a supply truck. As they passed through the southern edge of the American camp, Ishikawa spotted a strange sight, a large crate, its top removed, filled with Japanese flags. Not tattered, not burned, folded, kept. He moved closer. A guard noticed but didn't stop him. The crate bore a handwritten label in English and Japanese. recovered from battlefield, to be returned. Ishikawa's eyes widened. He reached in gently and pulled one from the stack. The Hinomaru, red sun centered on white, stared back at him, quiet and old. He turned it over and found names written across the cotton in neat brushstrokes. Messages from family, from classmates, from villagers back home. Return victorious. Die with honor. Your soul will live forever in the empire. He swallowed hard. This flag had belonged to someone. Perhaps one of the men buried on the ridge above. Perhaps a friend. Perhaps an enemy, now faceless. But what stunned him most wasn't the object. It was that the Americans had kept them, preserved them, not burned them, not laughed, not desecrated. They had seen the names and decided they mattered. It shook something deep in Ishikawa, because in that box he saw not just cloth, but the ghosts of a shattered belief system. The very words written by mothers who had raised their sons to die for the emperor, now stacked gently by the hands of those who were supposed to be demons. What kind of enemy does that? That night, Tanaka refused his meal. Sat alone, arms crossed, staring at the dirt. They are trying to make us forget, he muttered. Don't you see? But the rest of the men had already begun to change. They sat in groups now. Whispered stories of home, not battle, not orders, but real memories. One spoke of his father's rice field in Akita. Another described a dog who used to follow him to school. Ishikawa found himself telling a story he hadn't spoken aloud since the war began. Of fishing with his grandfather off the coast of Enoshima, the salt spray on his face, the gentle knock of bamboo poles against the boat. The men listened, not like soldiers, but like villagers around a winter fire. And as the tale ended, one of them, the mechanic who had wept during the meal, smiled. It was a faint smile, but real. They were remembering how to be human again, and yet shadows still clung to their hearts. That evening, the prisoners were invited, not ordered, but invited, to attend a funeral. 3 American Marines, killed by a landmine while clearing debris, were to be buried on the hill just above the camp. The guards said nothing. They simply gestured. Come if you wish. Some refused, others hesitated. Ishikawa went. He stood at the edge of the small gathering, helmet removed, hands folded. The chaplain read from a small black book. The wind stirred dust across the graves. The names of the dead were spoken. Then a bugle played. Soft, distant, like the cry of a bird rising toward the sky. As the final note faded, Ishikawa looked down at the mound of soil covering the young Americans. And he realized something brutal and profound. These boys died believing their cause was just as his comrades had, just as he nearly had. There were no heroes here, no demons, only men sent into fire by voices far away. He did not cry, but his throat closed, his fists clenched, not in anger, but in grief for the lie that war had promised. On the walk back, he said nothing. But when Tanaka glared and spat, "Did you bow to their graves too?" Ishikawa did not answer, because he no longer owed answers to rage. He had begun to plant something deeper, something quieter. He was not betraying his country. He was remembering his own soul. The days that followed passed with a rhythm both strange and tender, like a song once forbidden, now sung in whispers. The island, scorched and cratered, still bore the silence of the dead. But among the living, a fragile new sound had begun to take root. The sound of names. For months, none of the prisoners had spoken them. Not their own, not those of their brothers, not of mothers or sons or wives waiting in shattered cities across the sea. Names had become a luxury, something war erased and rank replaced. But now, under tarps patched with canvas and sky, they began to return. One man, while washing socks in a rusted basin, said quietly, "My daughter's name is Aiko. She would be 5 now." No one answered. No one needed to. The fact that the name was spoken aloud, without shame or threat, that was enough. Another replied. Days later, while trimming a cracked fingernail with a broken razor blade, "My brother died in Manila. His name was Shunji. He played flute." And Ishikawa, who had not dared speak her name since the ship left Yokohama, finally let it fall from his lips one morning while sweeping dust from the tent's floor. "Naoko, my sister. She gave me a paper crane before I left. No one asked what had happened to her. No one asked if she still lived." In war, questions like that carried pain too deep to stir. But her name fluttered in the air for a moment like the crane she had folded. Delicate, defiant, real. This was not surrender. This was remembrance. The Americans noticed the change, though they said little. They continued their routines. Food at regular hours, clean water, the occasional medical inspection. But more than once, a guard or chaplain lingered nearby when a prisoner murmured a story, not to eavesdrop, but simply to witness, and perhaps to understand. One evening, as the sun dissolved into the ocean and lit the sky in streaks of orange and crimson, an American lieutenant approached the perimeter. He held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were personal effects, items taken from surrendered soldiers weeks before. The war had scattered most beyond recovery, but some had been set aside. Photographs, letters, bits of cloth, a doll made of rice straw. The lieutenant called out through the interpreter, "These belong to some of you. We return them." No one moved at first. Then Ishikawa stepped forward. He was handed a photo, cracked and faded, but unmistakable. His family. His father, standing behind the boat's tiller. His sister, holding up the crane she'd made. He held it in both hands, afraid it might vanish. A murmur passed through the prisoners. Others stepped forward. Some received nothing. Others held old letters like sacred scrolls. One man dropped to his knees, clutching a hair comb wrapped in oilcloth, the only thing his wife had given him before he left. The guard did not interrupt. The American officers did not speak. This was not a transaction. This was ceremony. And in that sacred stillness, the men began to talk again. Not as warriors, not as prisoners, but as fathers, sons, brothers. A name spoken, a story shared, a breath released. Later that night, under the glow of a single lantern, Ishikawa and 2 others sat around a small tin stove. The fire inside was low, more warmth than flame. The corporal, the same quiet man from the bathhouse, approached and sat on an overturned crate beside them. He held out a folded object, a book, Japanese on one side, English on the other, a dictionary. He opened it and pointed. "Friend," he said in English. Then in Japanese, "Yuda." The men looked at each other. No one replied. But Ishikawa reached out and gently turned the page. He pointed to a word. "Guiru." The corporal read it, then said in English softly, "To go home." They nodded. And in that moment, no politics, no rank, no pride. They simply understood. The war was over, not just in strategy, but in spirit. The uniforms they wore still marked them as prisoners. The fences still stood. But within those lines, something sacred had taken root. The Americans no longer called them by number. The Japanese no longer called the Americans Gui-Chu, demons. Instead, they began to ask for names. And each time a name was given, it was as if a soul had stepped back into the world. No longer buried beneath orders, smoke, and death. The next morning, one of the guards greeted Ishikawa at roll call, not with prisoner, but with Ishikawa. Clumsy pronunciation, but sincere. Ishikawa blinked, nodded, and replied, "Tomu." It was not the guard's real name, of course, but it was close enough. The 2 men smiled slightly, not fully, not yet. but enough. Enough to plant the seed of memory, of names, of the sacred thread that binds all people in the quiet knowledge. You are seen. You are heard. You are not lost. The island still smelled of ash and metal. But now, from somewhere within the cracks of scorched earth, something small had begun to grow, and it had a name. The wind that morning smelled different. Still salted by the Pacific, still curled with the scent of scorched rock and rusting iron. But beneath it lingered something softer. It was the scent of laundry soap. Dozens of Japanese uniforms, faded khaki, patched with thread and ash, hung in long rows, fluttering from crude clotheslines strung between wooden posts. Steam curled from buckets. Bar soap lay shaved into slivers. And for the first time since their surrender, the prisoners were not washing under orders. They were washing because they had asked. It had started with a quiet request, passed through the interpreter 2 days earlier. Permission to wash uniforms, for dignity. The American officer had blinked, then nodded. Now, the prisoners stood barefoot on smooth stones, scrubbing sleeves and trouser legs against wooden washboards. The sound of water slapping cloth echoed across the camp like a strange kind of music. Rhythm without melody, but sacred all the same. Nearby, Ishikawa knelt over a basin. The water had gone cloudy from dirt, but he continued. His hands were raw, his knuckles cracked, but his face was calm. He was not washing for the guards. He was not washing because of discipline. He was washing away death, not to forget, but to remember what it meant to wear clothes with dignity. Not as a number, not as a target, but as a man. As he wrung out the shirt and laid it over the line, his eyes caught movement in the far distance, near the docks. A ship had arrived, large, gray, bristling with radio antennae and cranes, American markings. But its deck was not stacked with shells or tanks. It bore crates, thousands of them. Supplies, relief, rebuilding. Rumors moved fast. They say it's carrying mail. Medicines, for Japan. For the civilians, not the army. Some prisoners grew quiet. The words struck deep. For years, they had been taught the homeland would never bow. That surrender was a foreign disease. That death was cleaner than capture. But now, the homeland had bowed, and those crates, labeled in block letters with ports like Yokohama and Sendai, were not for soldiers. They were for the people. Children, widows, farmers. The emperor's voice had once echoed through every crackling radio, commanding sacrifice. Now, American crates arrived. Not with bombs, but with rice, milk, and bandages. It was a hard truth to swallow. That mercy had crossed the ocean faster than vengeance. That kindness, not retribution, was the first export of the enemy. Ishikawa watched the crates get unloaded for a long time. He did not speak. But something in his chest shifted once again. After lunch, an American chaplain asked for volunteers. "We're forming a burial detail," the interpreter said, "to rebury Japanese dead. Properly." The camp fell into silence. No one moved. Then Ishikawa stepped forward. So did the mechanic. Then the farmer from Hokkaido. Then 2 more. They were issued gloves and canvas sacks, shovels, maps. They walked for hours, accompanied by a single Marine guard. Up past the ridge where the final charges had been made, down into gullies where bones still rested among shattered helmets and melted steel. They found one shallow grave, rain exposed, the skull half revealed. A name tag lay nearby, corroded but readable. Private Nakamura, 3rd Infantry. Ishikawa swallowed. He did not know the man. But the name was Japanese. And that was enough. They knelt, they dug, they whispered. The reburial was not formal. No prayers were spoken. But the way the men placed the bones in the sack, the way they folded the remains of the uniform, it was as reverent as any temple ritual. One man tore a strip from his own sleeve and tied it around the sack before placing it in the new grave. "This is not surrender," he whispered. "This is coming home. The Marine watched silently. He did not interrupt. By evening, they had found 4 bodies, each reburied, each given a name, if one could be found. No one wept, but no one could speak either. They returned to camp in silence, not in shame, but in something closer to peace. That night, a storm swept in from the east. The tents rattled, rain lashed the island, but inside the prisoner quarters, men lay dry, warm, boots tucked beside them, hands folded across chests like monks in rest. And in the dark, Ishikawa spoke a sentence he had not dared to say in weeks. "When I return home, I will plant a tree." No one mocked him. One man replied, "I will build a new roof." Another whispered, "I will teach my son to read." Without hatred. And then, as if the island itself held its breath, the rain stopped. Just long enough for the men to hear the waves again. They did not sound like war. They sounded like return. They sounded like return. By the time the sun lifted above the eastern ridge the next morning, the scent of wet earth lingered in the camp. A scent not of rot, but of something breathing again. The soil, damp and dark, held a promise beneath its surface. That day, the prisoners were issued new clothing, not uniforms, not prison garb, just simple, clean civilian wear. Cotton shirts, trousers, thin jackets with buttons that still caught the morning light. No insignia, no ranks. It was jarring. Some hesitated to change. Their tattered military tunics, no matter how stained or threadbare, had become part of them, part of their grief, their identity, their sacrifice. But slowly, one by one, they exchanged fabric. And when Ishikawa slipped the shirt over his shoulders, he felt something he could not name. It was not relief, not pride. It was lighter than both. Perhaps it was permission. To no longer be a soldier, to no longer be afraid. Across the camp, mirrors were passed hand to hand, polished tin, shards of old Jeep glass, a fragment of airplane canopy someone had smuggled from the mechanics depot. The men studied their faces as if seeing strangers, not because they had forgotten themselves, but because they had survived themselves. In the corner, Tanaka stood unmoving. He hadn't changed clothes. His uniform sleeves still bore the faded anchor of the Imperial Navy. Ishikawa approached him slowly. "They gave us these," he said gently, "not to make us forget, but to let us begin." Tanaka's eyes narrowed. "You think they do this out of honor?" "No," Ishikawa said. "I think they do it because they've lost enough men to know what it costs not to." That evening, a new structure appeared near the fence. A wooden archway. It wasn't large. No paint, no signs. But the message was clear. Through the interpreter, the guards explained, "A few of you, those with clear records, will begin labor beyond the fence. Supervised, but free to move. There will be no armed escort. You will walk through the gate, and you will return." The words struck like thunder, not because of the labor, but because of the trust. To step beyond the wire, unshackled, unguarded, even with eyes watching, was more than freedom. It was rebirth, and it demanded something terrifying. Choice. The next morning, 10 men stood at the gate. Ishikawa was among them. He felt the weight of the moment in his chest, like a drumbeat buried beneath his ribs. The guard opened the gate without flourish. The fence creaked. The wind stirred the dust. And then they stepped forward, not as captives, not as soldiers, as men. Beyond the camp lay open ground, brush, machinery, tents, and trucks. American engineers worked to clear roads and repair docks. The Japanese laborers were assigned simple tasks: moving crates, digging post holes, hauling lumber. But no one shouted, no one struck. An American sergeant handed out gloves. Another passed out water flasks. A third corrected a man's digging posture. Not with ridicule, but a tap on the elbow and a demonstration. Even laughter broke the air, shy at first, then easier. It was not camaraderie, not yet, but it was no longer enmity. At noon, the Americans passed out sandwiches and fruit. One man, the same farmer from Hokkaido, bit into a peach for the first time in 2 years. Juice dripped down his chin. He wiped it away and bowed, not out of ritual, but instinct. The sergeant looked confused, then chuckled. "You're welcome," he said, and handed the man another. Ishikawa watched it all in silence, not out of distance, but reverence. When the sun dipped low, the men returned through the same gate. The guard at the post didn't lift his rifle. He simply nodded. Every single man returned. No one ran. No one betrayed the gate. Because they understood. What they had walked through was not just a hole in the fence. It was a doorway between worlds. That night, under a soft sky salted with stars, the camp sat quieter than usual. The men didn't speak much, but they sat closer together. Tanaka did not come to dinner, but when Ishikawa returned to his tent, he found the naval officer seated in the shadows, holding his tunic folded across his knees. He didn't look up. He only said, "I think tomorrow I'll take the walk too." Ishikawa nodded. He said nothing, because nothing more needed to be said. The fence was still there. The past was still there. But now there was a way through both. A week passed. Then another. The rhythms of the camp, once jagged and sharp like broken glass, had softened. Men began to rise before the whistle. Tasks were performed without being told. Conversations, once whispered, now wove through the air with gentle familiarity. But beneath the surface, something still stirred. Something that could not be scrubbed clean with soap or soothed by warm meals. It came to a head one windless morning when a young private named Fujita approached Ishikawa, eyes lowered, hands clutching something beneath his jacket. "I kept it," he said quietly. "Since the landing, I shouldn't have." He unwrapped the bundle. It was a Japanese battle flag. The sun motif, sharp red against yellowed white. Dozens of signatures still traced across the fabric. Family, friends, teachers. The corners were torn. One edge was singed. But it was intact. Ishikawa stepped back slightly. The flag, once a symbol of holy war, of glory promised through death, now looked like a ghost. "You know what they'll say if they find it," Fujita said, his voice thin. "They'll think I'm clinging to the empire or hiding shame." He looked up. "But it's not that. I don't know how to let go of it." Ishikawa understood. To discard it would feel like betrayal, but to keep it meant something else entirely now. That evening, he spoke to the American chaplain, asked for something unusual. The chaplain listened, furrowed his brow, and nodded slowly. And so, the next morning, just beyond the edge of the prisoner compound, a small pit was dug. Stones were placed in a circle. A fire was lit. Fujita stood before it, the flag in his hands. Ishikawa beside him. Tanaka, too. Dozens gathered around in silence. This was not a ceremony born of surrender. It was a funeral, not of a nation, but of a version of it, of the lies they had been fed, of the orders that had poisoned their youth, of the impossible oaths sworn in classrooms to men they would never meet. Fujita lowered the flag into the flames. The fire did not resist. It rose to greet the cloth gently, not in rage, but in warmth. Smoke curled into the air. It did not smell of gunpowder. It smelled of old ink, dried sweat, and the final breath of something once sacred, now laid to rest. No one spoke. But when the last thread blackened and crumbled, Ishikawa whispered, "Now we are only men." That afternoon, the Americans opened the radio tent. 2 speakers crackled to life. For the first time since the surrender, the prisoners were allowed to listen to Japanese broadcasts. A new voice echoed from the speaker. Not military, not imperial. A woman's voice, clear, gentle, reading news of food deliveries to Osaka, updates on school reopenings in Hiroshima, a list of names from the Red Cross, survivors found, letters on their way. The men sat on crates, boots dusty, heads bowed, tears sliding without shame. Home had not disappeared. It had changed, but it had survived. That night, Ishikawa took a strip of cloth he had saved, torn from his old uniform, and stitched it into the lining of his new shirt. Not as defiance, but remembrance. He no longer needed the flag, but he would carry the memory, not of empire, but of the people who had written on it. Return safe. Do not forget us. Come back whole. He was not whole, not yet, but he was walking toward it. In the morning, when the guard opened the gate for labor duty, Ishikawa stepped through with steady steps. Fujita followed. Tanaka too. The fence didn't creak this time. It simply opened, and far in the distance, the waves kissed the shore with a sound that had once signaled death. But now it sounded like home. The final roll call came quietly, without ceremony. No speeches, no salutes, no barked orders. Just a list of names, spoken slowly, carefully, like the reading of a prayer. Ishikawa stood with the others in the rising dawn, his breath visible in the cool island air. Across from him, a young American officer read from a clipboard. One by one, prisoners were called forward. Their names, not numbers, echoed between the tents like footsteps returning to places once lost. Each man received a small satchel, a change of clothes, a travel document bearing the U.S. seal, a slip of paper with Red Cross contact information, and a name scribbled at the bottom. Someone waiting back home. And then came the boots, the same ones issued weeks ago. Some scuffed, some newly polished, some repaired with strips of canvas or patched with wax thread traded from American mechanics. But they were theirs. The officer did not take them back. He only said, "Keep them." A few men blinked, confused. But then Ishikawa understood. The boots were no longer military gear. They were not property of the victors. They were testimony of survival, of walking through fire and choosing not to hate, of men who had entered the camp barefoot and now left clothed not just in fabric, but in dignity. As the transport trucks rumbled to life near the edge of the landing strip, some prisoners climbed aboard in silence. Others looked back at the island, at the ridge where comrades lay buried, at the bathhouse still steaming in morning light, at the wooden gate that had opened not just fences, but hearts. Ishikawa lingered at the edge of the truck. His eyes scanned the faces of the American guards and one last time. The corporal who had handed him the towel, the chaplain who had returned the photo, the interpreter who had said, "You are not our enemy." The war was, he bowed, not deeply, just enough. And the corporal, silent as ever, lifted 2 fingers to his forehead and gave a brief, almost lazy salute. But there was something behind it. Respect. The truck bounced along the dirt road, the wind whipping past as the camp shrank behind them. Ishikawa sat with his hands folded, the letter from the Red Cross in his pocket. His sister was alive, Naoko, living in Yokosuka with relatives. Thin, they said, pale but healthy. A letter from her would meet him at the repatriation port. He closed his eyes. The hum of the engine soothed something deep inside. For the first time since he had left home, Ishikawa allowed himself to imagine what would come after. Not just the return, but rebuilding. Not walls, not borders, but trust, honor that didn't wear a uniform. He imagined a wooden house, a quiet garden, a small stone path from the door to the gate. And beside that door, he would place the boots, not polished, not hidden, just there. A reminder that he had walked through hate and been spared, that the enemy had offered water and not fire, that mercy, once given, must be carried forward, that the true weight of a nation is not in its flag, but in how it treats those it defeats. As the island faded behind them, the prisoners sat in stillness. Some slept, some cried, some clutched their satchels like lifelines. And as the wind passed through the open bed of the truck, Ishikawa thought not of orders or loyalty or glory. He thought of a hand placing a towel beside him, a stranger pouring coffee into a tin cup, a flame devouring a flag, a guard calling him by his name. He thought of how war had tried to make him a weapon, and how peace, offered without demand, had made him a man again. The boots on his feet were not American. They were not Japanese. They were simply human, and he would wear them home, so that when his sister opened the door, she would see in the dust of his steps the proof that even after war, kindness still walks.